AQA A Level Law, Negligence. There are three main parts of the tort law of negligence, these being the duty of care, the breach of duty, and damage. They all have separate concepts and cases to support them. Negligence also is only pursued in novel circumstances. The duty of care must be established. The concept of a duty of care was developed in the case of Donahue v. Stevenson by Lord Atkin as you must take reasonable care as to avoid acts or omissions which you can reasonably foresee would be likely to injure your neighbour. The first step to proving this is, was damage or harm reasonably foreseeable? This is taken from reasonably foresee from Lord Atkin's quote. It's an objective test which asks, would a reasonable person in the defendant's position have foreseen that someone in the claimant's position might be injured? Shown by the case of Kent v. Griffiths, where it was reasonably foreseeable that the claimant would suffer if the ambulance was late to arrive. The second part of proving this is to develop if there was a proximity between the claimant and defendant. This is taken from the your neighbour part of Lord Atkin's quote and requires that they must be in close proximity in terms of space, time, or relationship. Shown in the case of Warhill v. Young, as the defendant was not in the proximity of the claimant. Finally, it must be shown that it's fair, just, and reasonable to impose a duty, especially on public authorities. An example of this happening is in the case of Hill v. Chief Constable of West Yorkshire Police, where a supposed duty imposed would mean that the police would act in an offensive way rather than assisting in the way they should be. Secondly, on to breach of duty. Establishing the breach of duty to the previously mentioned duty of care. The concept of breach of duty is falling below the standard of care appropriate to the specific duty in question. The standard is measured against that of the reasonable man. The reasonable man test is established by the case of Blythe, and is stated as negligence is the omission to do something which a reasonable man would do. There are special characteristics which alter the standard, however, the first of which are professionals. This is in an area where the defendant has expertise. They will be held to a higher standard, shown in the case of Bolam, whether the claimant underwent electroconvulsive therapy without relaxant drugs. The defendant was held to the standard of a professional, a doctor, and it was shown that they acted appropriately to this higher standard. Learners do not get an altered standard. This is shown in the case of Nettleship v. Weston, wherein the driver, despite being a learner, was liable for breaking her instructor's hand when she crashed the car she was learning in. Children do get a lower standard, which is held relative to their age, shown in the case of Mullins v. Richard, where the defendant was only expected to meet the standard of a 13-year-old girl, and not a reasonable man. Next, to look at risk factors. There are four primarily. Foreseeability of harm is the first one. If the risk of harm is not known of, then there is and can be no breach, shown in the case of the Rowe v. Minister of Health case, where an ampule of contaminated anaesthetic results in the claimant's injury. However, there was no knowledge that the anaesthetic was contaminated or could even be contaminated, as the technology to see the microcracks in the ampule was not available. Size of the risk is the second one. In cases where the risk is small, it's unlikely that there will be a breach, shown in the case of Bolton v. Stone, where a cricket ball hit and injured someone on the street outside of the grounds. The risk was deemed too small to cause a breach in this circumstance, as it had only been hit off the grounds 6 times in 30 years. Special characteristics of the claimant must also be looked at. In cases where the risk of harm is greater to a specific victim, a higher standard is expected, shown in the case of Paris v. SBC, where the victim was already blind in one eye, and the defendant neglected to give them goggles, resulted in the claimant becoming fully blind from a workplace injury. There are also lower standards of care in emergency situations, if there are benefits to taking the risks. This is seen in the case of Watt, where firefighters were injured when lifting gear into a vehicle not fitted to carry that specific gear. Thirdly, onto damage. The concept of damage is the idea that the claimant is owed a duty of care that was broken, and the damage is caused by the breach of the duty. This includes both factual causation and remoteness. factual causation begins with the but-for test. But for the defendant's act or omission, the claimant would not have suffered, shown by the case of Barnum. In some cases, there may be multiple causes, making it difficult to establish the specific cause, shown by the case of Wilshire. The principal rule, the eggshell rule, is the idea that the defendant must take the claimant as they found them, shown by the case of Wilshire. The motive, on the other hand, is the idea that the damage must not be too remote from the negligence of the claimant, shown clearly in the case of Wagenmound, where the damage resulted from a myriad of coinciding coincidences. The type of injury must also be foreseeable. However, the manner in which it occurs does not have to be, as seen in the case of Hughes. There are two other extra things to look at. Firstly, the types of damage. There are two: pecuniary losses, which are special or incalculable losses which cannot be calculated, such as a broken arm or someone dying. However, non-pecuniary losses are losses which can be calculated. I should also be looking at defences. There are two: valenti and contributory. Valenti is a full defence to the claim and argues that the claimant gave full consent to what occurred, either direct or implied consent. Contributory is not a full defence, on the other hand, and merely suggests that the claimant may have had a partial involvement in the damage. This defence instead mitigates the compensation the defendant is forced to give.